Welcome to Trashmagination, a podcast about reimagining trash. I'm Carla Brown. Today's episode is about weighted blankets. A weighted blanket is a heavy blanket that some say can be helpful to those with sensory processing disorders, anxiety, and autism. Sensory processing disorders affect both kids and adults. It makes it more difficult to process the information that comes through your five senses. And research has found that gentle pressure can help. My daughter asked for a weighted blanket. You can get a weighted blanket online for $50 to $200, but you know me, I wanted to see if I could make one from upcycled materials rather than buying a new one or buying new materials. I had been saving denim jeans for few decades, and I thought it was such a heavy fabric, and I wondered if it could give a similar feeling as the weighted blankets that rely on inserting plastic or glass beads. I did a podcast episode about creative reuse of denim a few years ago, and in that episode I talked about boro, which is a Japanese stitching technique that involves mending something over and over again. And many boro pieces can be quite heavy as people add new layers of patches and stitching. In today's episode, I'll share what I learned about making your own weighted blanket with or without beads. First, here are some fun facts about weighted blankets. On every website I researched, it was recommended to get one that is about 10% of your body weight. So if you weigh about 150 pounds, that means a 15-pound weighted blanket, which is a typical size of blanket based on what I see for sale online. Most weighted blankets get their weight by containing plastic or glass beads. Most weighted blankets are sewn on a grid, so the beads can move to form around you, but only within a square in the grid, so the weight does not shift all to one corner and rip open the seams. One consideration when buying or making a weighted blanket is whether you want only the weight but not the warmth. If you get a blanket made from breathable materials and there's no fill inside it other than the glass or plastic beads, you will get a heavy blanket, but it's not necessarily warm. On the other hand, the blanket I made from denim is very warm, especially since I also added squares of recycled wool, both to add weight and a fun design. If you live somewhere that a weighted blanket is too hot, an alternative idea is to make a sheet that fits tightly to your bed, like a tube, and that will put pressure on your body but doesn't add warmth. And you can learn more about this idea on the blog And Next Comes L, which has resources for those supporting neurodiverse people. They have a tutorial for making pressurizing bed sheets by sewing jersey fabric in a giant tube and then pulling it up about 2/3 of the way up on the mattress. If you put a weighted blanket in your normal washing machine, it might be very hard on your machine. For a blanket that is about 10 pounds, you can probably still wash it in your washing machine if you don't put anything else in with it. But if you have a heavier blanket, you might need to take it to a commercial laundry to get it cleaned. And so that's why some weighted blankets come with a washable cover. You want a weighted blanket that fits your body, but not necessarily your bed. So if the blanket is too large and hangs over the edge of the bed, the weight of the blanket can pull it right off your bed. So many weighted blankets are twin size, or about 60 inches by 80 inches, or 1.5 meters by 2 meters. And so even if you have a queen size bed or double size bed, they might get a twin sized weighted blanket just to avoid this problem of the blanket sliding right off the bed. In the case of my daughter's blanket, I wasn't too worried about the issue because she likes to tuck the blanket around and under herself, and that means it won't be hanging off the bed too much, but we'll have to see how it works out. Next, I want to talk about the plastic and glass beads or pellets that are inside many weighted blankets. So when I learned that this was the most common method for adding weight to the blankets, my first reaction was that the world doesn't need any more plastic pellets and I didn't want to buy them. The photos of the plastic pellets reminded me of photos that I've seen when I was researching the podcast episode about beach trash. There are many pellets on on beaches, and they're called nurdles, and they are a major pollution problem in the ocean because animals think they are fish eggs and eat them. However, there might be an environmentally friendlier way to still use plastic pellets. If you already own a bunch of stuffed animals that are filled with those pellets, like Beanie Babies, and you are already planning to creatively reuse them, this could be a great creative reuse idea. So I checked, and a Beanie Baby toy weighs, on average, about 6 ounces. So let's assume about 4 ounces of that is the filler, is the little pellets inside. So that means it would take about 60 Beanie Babies to get enough pellets for a 15-pound weighted blanket. Now, you might not own 60 Beanie Babies that need recycling, but you might be able to gather enough if you put out a call on your local Buy Nothing group. And even if half your filler was recycled, that's better than none. And I was thinking, for example, in the case of the blanket I made for my daughter, the blanket ended up weighing about 10 pounds with the materials that I had. So if I just had maybe 5 pounds of pellets, that would get it up to like 15 pounds, which is a more optimum weight for the blanket. So now let's talk about glass pellets. So on Amazon, you can buy 15 pounds of glass pellets for $43 as of today. So from a cost perspective, even though it might be fun to make your own weighted blanket, the truth is that many weighted blankets cost about $43 or even less. So it might just make sense to buy the blanket and save your sewing time for more creative projects. But also from an environmental perspective, it still has more impact on the environment to produce glass beads than to reuse materials that already exist near you. So if you feel like sewing, go for it. If you do decide to make a weighted blanket that contains pellets, I'll link to tutorials in the show notes that explains how to sew the blanket on a grid, and it shows how they use a long cardboard tube to make the pellets go down into the right spot on the blanket, and it shows how they portion out the pellets to make sure that the blanket is an even weight throughout. So all the tutorials I will share in the show notes are for the weighted blankets that use pellets. There were lots of great comments on those videos from people who've made weighted blankets and people who have family members who are neurodiverse. So I'll share some of the interesting tips I read there. So first, people said that you should avoid using fabrics with busy prints on them if you're making your blanket for someone who has autism or Asperger's syndrome. It can be challenging for someone if the prints do not line up in the way that they expect. For example, if the images are not all going in the same direction. And some suggested using more muted colors as well. A great fabric option could be minky, fleece, or a similar fake fur fabric because it has a similar sensation as patting a pet cat or dog, which can be very comforting for some people. I say use whatever fabric you have on hand, and if you have that, great. And as you'll hear, I made my weighted blanket from denim and wool because that's what I owned, and also I prefer natural fibers. If you do add pellets, you have to be very careful when you're sewing because you don't want to hit one of those plastic or glass beads with the needle on your sewing machine or it will break the needle. So to avoid this, people use pins to create a compartment for the beads out of the way from the needle while they sew. Some people suggested it's a good idea to sew this project with a walking foot. That's an attachment that you put on your sewing machine that helps walk the fabric through the place where the needle goes up and down. And this is extra helpful with such a heavy project and also if you use more slippery fabrics. So I used to have a walking foot, but I used it so much that it broke and I haven't had a chance to replace it. So I sewed my project without a walking foot and it went just fine, but I still think that is a good suggestion if you have one. Holding the heavy blanket in place under your sewing machine can be very tiring, which I learned as I was sewing my weighted blanket. So it's best to sew this project on a large table that can help support the weight of the blanket. Next, I'll tell you about my experience making a weighted blanket from recycled denim and wool. I'm not exactly sure how many pairs of jeans went into my blanket, but I would guess about 15. I also added red squares from a heavy winter coat that was seriously out of fashion, and I disassembled. My mom helped me disassemble it, and we washed it, and we used about half the coat in the design of this blanket. For the back of the blanket, I used a flat fleece bedsheet, and the challenge with that type of fabric is it's very stretchy, and that makes it challenging to get it to lie flat. But if you just add more pins and really pay attention, it's definitely feasible. To make my blanket, I disassembled the jeans and I cut them into 7-inch squares. I laid the squares in a repeating pattern of light, medium, and dark denim, just for fun. And then I sewed the squares in rows, and then I sewed the rows together. I used a very tight stitch on my machine so it would be very strong, because I knew that it would get pulled and tugged as she would lay under it and she would be in her bed. I didn't use a denim needle, but it would be a great idea to do that. I just didn't have one handy. I cut the squares from my recycled wool coat and sewed them then in a random pattern over the blanket, again, just for fun and also to add a little bit of weight. The only new items I added to the quilt were that I did put in a new package of quilt batting inside, as well as I put new fabric on the binding. And when I say new, these are just items I had in my fabric stash, so I was happy to use them up. And I hand quilted the front to the back of the quilt with big stitches in various colors of pearl cotton thread. And I quilted it only on the vertical so that my daughter would know at a glance which way to lay the blanket for the optimum spacing. Plus, that seemed to be enough quilting to make a nice solid blanket. Another benefit of quilting it only along the vertical is that if I decided later if she wanted it to be heavier and I wanted to add some plastic or glass beads, I could open up the binding on one end and I could slide them down into the vertical tubes, and then I could sew a grid to make a more typical weighted blanket. Here are the final stats about my weighted blanket. So it ended up weighing 10 pounds, which is a bit light for an adult. But this was my first try and I learned a lot. I think if you wanted to make a 15 or 20 pound weighted blanket using only denim, you would maybe have to double up your denim, which would make it maybe tricky to get through your sewing machine. So I'm not sure if it's really possible. The dimensions of my quilt were 78 by 86 inches, or approximately 6 feet or 2 meters square. I could have made it a little bit smaller, and that would have maybe it would make it lighter, but it would also make it so it might not slide off the bed as much. And the rows that I sewed contained 12 squares, and there were 14 rows. So thank you for listening. Please let me know if you have made a weighted blanket from recycled materials by connecting with me at trashmagination@gmail.com. For more info about upcycling denim, I recommend my Trashmagination episode 55. And be sure to share this podcast episode with anyone you know who could benefit from making a weighted blanket and who likes to creatively reuse blue jeans. I personally tested the blanket. It made me feel very comforted and sleepy. And I actually wanted to keep it for myself, and I might make another one for myself. Until next time, may you see trash as a source of art in your life.